Alright, so we all know that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom go together. The original adventure of the hero of the wild and its direct sequel continuing the story of the Hyrule in which he lives. But have you ever wondered how Hyrule has changed and how it's stayed the same economically speaking? In other words, how does it really affect gameplay specifically for you, the player, as it pertains to the acquisition of goods and resources? All the commodities found around Hyrule, and how much more or less of a grind is it truly in each game to achieve total abundance, financial freedom? Well, that's what we're here breaking down today. So if you want to know how prices of different goods and services have gone up or down, how natural resources like hardy stuff among other things were affected by the upheaval, or if the form of government and economy we see in these games could even exist, this is the Zelda Deep Dive for you. Because I want a complete overview of the sectors and industries, trade and market systems, the role of government and leadership or lack thereof, etc., and bring it all together to find answers that'll help explain some of the biggest changes affecting overall gameplay and player experience between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. And first of all, I'm not a qualified economist, I'm just a researcher here, and this is obviously for entertainment purposes only. I mean, Hyrule isn't even a real place. Still, I want to balance this detailed analysis with facts and figures, so let me begin by emphatically stating the state of the Hyrulean economy is dubious at best. Without going into a rabbit hole's worth of information, suffice it to say the Kingdom of Hyrule is an ancient monarchy which operates with a mixed economic system. Rupees, I assume you already know, serve as the primary currency, and there's a blend with elements mainly of a traditional economy where survival and resource-based trade are central, and a market economy driven by independent wandering merchants like Beetle and localized commerce. These traders facilitate a flow of goods between isolated communities, selling items like arrows, food, elixirs, wildlife, all sorts of stuff. A bartering system also exists with many NPCs trading goods or services in exchange for specific items rather than rupees as seen in many side quests, with hints of a command economy guided by the overarching influence of the royal family, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Through the story that plays out between the two games, being set several years apart, we see Hyrule in states of everything from peaceful prosperity and times of calamitous, imprisoning war, and everything in between. It's in a post-apocalyptic state in Breath of the Wild, and it's at the onset of a gradual recovery and rebuilding phase in Tears of the Kingdom. And in both games, we see flashbacks to simpler times. Throughout it all, residents in different villages around the overworld rely heavily on subsistence activities such as farming, hunting, fishing, treasure hunting, raising livestock or cuckoos, and crafting goods to meet local needs, and whatever else. If not joining the royal military, right? And the market system also thrives in hotspots like Terrytown in Tears of the Kingdom, where entrepreneurial projects and growing trade networks symbolize the kingdom's greater recovery efforts. On that note, general material availability has a massive impact on this discussion, as we'll see. Certain items are significantly more or less abundant between games or have even been completely removed. However, tons of new materials have been added. Some items have multiple new uses in Tears that were simply not a factor in Breath of the Wild. And the sales prices of many things has fluctuated. For example, the fuse ability in Tears of the Kingdom makes items like gems useful for things other than just selling for rupees and clothing upgrades. Now you can fuse to an arrowhead or a weapon to replicate the built-in elemental arrows or swords in Breath of the Wild, or simply barehand throw them for special elemental effects. Rubies have explosive firepower, sapphires will flash freeze, topaz electrocute, and opal will splash with water. To acquire these gems, besides the occasional reward from NPCs or whatever, there are 3,304 ore deposits in Breath of the Wild. 258 of them are rare, meaning they have a higher chance to drop more valuable gems. In contrast, there are only 1,321 deposits in Tears of the Kingdom, a 60% reduction, and 192 are rare, Of course, there are also explosive arrows and ancient arrows in Breath of the Wild, whereas in Tears of the Kingdom we have bomb flowers and ancient blades, both of which are significantly less abundant in Tears than their Breath of the Wild counterparts, especially the ancient blades. And while we can purchase ancient blades from a construct after completing the Spirit Temple in the depths, it's not worth it. At a cost of 50 Zonai, it takes a significant amount of time mining to farm that much Zonai just to trade it in for one single-use item. You're better off using that Zonai for auto builds or to purchase more crystallized charges to up your battery power. And as far as plain arrows go, it's quite comparable between both games to collect them through break-in crates and barrels or clay pots. They can also be purchased for a reasonable price from most general stores for the same price between games, or from Beetle at the stables or wherever. And instead of other elemental arrows, we have options for multiple materials that'll work. So rubies or fire fruit, sapphire or ice fruit, topaz or shock fruit, essentially giving us more opportunity to keep inventory of elemental arrows and weaponry. Okay, so what about other materials? There used to be so much hearty stuff in Breath of the Wild. Between durians, truffles, radishes, and fish, Breath of the Wild had 755 items scattered around, and Tears only has 167. Yikes. Once you know where to farm the hearty stuff in Breath of the Wild, you could quite easily set yourself up for success. Hearty bass used to be decently abundant in West Necluda and the Akala Highlands, but now they're only found in the sky, in the Tabantha and West Hebra Sky archipelagos, and in far less quantity. Hardy blue-shell snails lived in dense populations on beaches around Hyrule, especially surrounding the Lanayru Bay, but have since gone completely extinct in Tears of the Kingdom. Likewise, hardy durians, once one of the most abundant hardy foods in Breath of the Wild. Farming was especially fruitful in the Faron region, and red Hinox would even drop them sometimes, have completely disappeared from the entire map. As you can imagine, a similar pattern stands with Endura food, which is the stamina equivalent ingredient of hearty food giving you the yellow hearts or the yellow meters. This was a disappointing realization during my first Tears of the Kingdom playthrough, to say the least, because after the Great Sky Island and getting the paraglider, stocking up on valuable resources was my primary objective. So when I made it to Faron and found nothing, I thought, oh cool, they must grow somewhere else now, and it felt so fresh, the exploration was coming back. But as I played and realized these items were significantly cut back or gone altogether, I found myself missing them quite a bit, to be honest. But once you do enough shrines and upgrade your life and stamina vessels, it's sort of a moot point. As for Hinox, while they no longer drop hardy durians in Tears, they do of course drop their Hinox horns, which brings me to my next point: monster parts. What about guts, tails, talons, toenails, horns, etc.? All were used in Breath of the Wild for armor upgrades, elixirs, exchange at the Fang and Bone for gift cards, which we'll get to in a moment, or of course, selling for rupees. They'd range from a bokoblin horn at 3 rupees a piece, which still goes for in Tears, to a Lionel gut, which is 200 rupees in each game. However, in Tears, we have a tie for the highest selling monster part in the Gliok Guts, which also goes for 200 rupees. But since Lionel Guts are 200 rupees, I would argue Gliok Guts should have been 300 or 400 due to the increased danger and difficulty of slaying those beasts, especially the kings. But then again, the kings drop the same drops as the other elemental Glioks, making them nothing really special at the end of the day. And because we confuse monster parts to our weapons in Tears, which is arguably their most valuable use, I must note how the Silver Lionel Saberhorn adds 55 attack power to your fused weapon, or for any Gerudo weapon, anything fused gets double the power, making Silver Lionel Saberhorns add 110 attack power, which is insane, while all Gliok horns only add a 30 plus boost when fused. For reference, a Blue Mane Lionel Saberhorn adds 33, so despite their intimidating presence, Glioks are still beneath Blue Lionels, at least in terms of ferocity and value of parts. But that's just the mean monsters. What about the nice monsters? There used to be 3 dragons from which we could farm 4 unique parts: horns, fangs, claws, and scales. Now there are 4 dragons with 5 farmable parts. The originals sell for the same price in both games. Horns go for 300 rupees, so 100 more than Lionel's and Gleeok's. Then fangs are at 250, claws at 180, and scales go for 150. Now we also have spikes, which are only worth 30 but are much more abundant. And the problem with dragon part farming is that it became a hell of a tedious grind in Tears of the Kingdom, whereas in Breath of the Wild we're able to set up campfires and go for a new part every in-game day cycle by camping near their spawn points. Now in Tears, you gotta wait 10 real-life minutes to farm another part from any given dragon once you've shot it, and the 3 original dragons are on a constant flight path alternating between the sky and the depths, while the light dragon circles the entire map, making it extremely difficult to efficiently keep track of where they are when it's time to go for another part. And with all this talk about monster parts, now it's a good time for a brief discussion about Mon. Mon being short for monster, or money because it's monster money, the preferred, nay, only method of payment accepted by Kilton, owner of the Fang and Bone Traveling Monster Market Emporium, where he'll convert your more or less valuable monster parts into Mon and sell you things from his shop. But he's no longer in business by the time we meet again in Tears, which is crazy because the sheer increase in different monster parts would have been fun to compare and really good for his business. You know, we used to only have one type of Lionel horn. Now there's a saber variety and a mace variety, and they're all unique to each the red, blue, white, and silver Lionels, and this holds true for the other monsters as well. Instead, now he builds statues of monsters in Terrytown, and his brother Koltin does a straight-up trade barter system style of different goods for different numbers of bubble gems. And there's no other use for bubble gems either. They're a special inventory item that has only one use, and so they don't even have the option to be sold, otherwise it'd mess everything up. But Kilton not taking our monster parts and trading them for Mon and Tears of the Kingdom, it's a blessing in disguise, because we need those parts for better weapons, clothing upgrades, the occasional elixir, and since there are so many, we'll still abundantly stock up on pretty quick over time most of them, and it's a good way to sell off a bunch of stuff for rupees too. So that's the organic monsters, but now what about the robo monsters? Sheikah Guardians and Zonai constructs. There are 6 distinct ancient parts in Breath of the Wild. In order from most common and cheap to most rare and valuable, they are screws, which go for 12 rupees each, springs, 15, gears, 30, shafts, 40, cores, 80, and giant cores for 200. In my experience, as you play, screws, springs, and gears all build stock pretty easily in your inventory towards abundance, and I sometimes had to do a bit more work if I needed a few extra ancient shafts or cores or giant cores for upgrades and supplies. Giant cores especially would require multiple guardian hunting trips over many blood moons, and so how do the Zonai bots compare? Keeping in mind the highest value drop from a guardian is the giant core at 200 rupees, the highest value drop from the highest level construct is a Captain Construct 4 horn, which sells for a mere 30 rupees. Now you might be like, what about Flux constructs? Well, yeah, they're higher rank than captains, but they don't drop any inventoriable parts the captains don't already supply. Fluxes can, however, drop a core, so it's cool to see the same name of a part being used in 2 different mechanical enemies between the 2 games. But with the Zonai constructs, this time the core is exclusively used for the new fuse ability to add a sweet attack up buff. It seems developers are trying to dissuade players from selling their construct parts in favor of fusing or upgrading, and of course, fluxes can drop other items we haven't discussed yet. Zonai charges, both regular and large, which sell for a whopping 6 and 10 rupees respectively, making it absolutely clear at this point the sale price is so low to purposely discourage selling for rupees, as these parts are far more valuable, especially as you progress through the game, when traded for Zonai devices at dispensaries or as fuel to power your Zonai battery pack. But now we're talking about rupees a bit, so let's dive a little bit deeper. There are 6 colors representing 6 amounts. Gold is 300, silver 100, purple are 50, red 20, blue 5, and green 1. Unlike most, if not all previous canonical Zelda games, in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, rupees don't appear when cutting grass or defeating most monsters, with the exception of the Yiga clan members and Bloopies. I can and eventually probably will do a whole separate video on rupee theory. And if that particularly interests you, let me know by saying rupees or rupee essay or something in the comments. There are also Octoroks with treasures on their heads, but we'll talk about chests. Rupees can however be found under rocks, inside barrels and crates like I said, and of course, in treasure chests. There are more treasures total in Tears of the Kingdom than there are in Breath of the Wild. 1,411 versus 1,362, but most contain weapons or other items. If we narrow them down to chests containing rupees, Breath of the Wild has 267 and Tears of the Kingdom has 81. That's a 69.5% reduction. Of those, there are 36 gold rupees found inside chests in Breath of the Wild, and there are only 3 in Tears of the Kingdom, a 92% reduction. Likewise, there are 108 silver rupees in chests in Breath of the Wild, and only 5 in Tears, a 95% reduction. Whoa. Purple rupees in chests, there are 117 in Breath of the Wild versus 24 in Tears. Then chests containing red rupees are actually more abundant in Tears by a decent little margin, 15 to 6, big whoop. There are 5 blue rupees in chests in Tears of the Kingdom and 0 in Breath of the Wild. And as for green rupee chests, Breath of the Wild has 0 again, whereas Tears has a total of 29, the biggest W for Tears. So the more valuable rupees have gotten far more rare, and the smaller amounts are slightly more abundant. Perhaps we can say the reason there are far less chests out there in Tears with high value rupees is because over the years since Breath of the Wild, Link and other fellow travelers found them already, and during the upheaval maybe some new chests were unearthed, but they just don't have the most valuable rewards inside. That's all I got. And as we've seen through the Hyrule Comparison series, a lot of times where there was a treasure chest with a bunch of rupees inside, maybe something else now, say a Korok or whatever. Anyway, some of the most common and most vanilla ways to farm rupees in Breath of the Wild are to either cook good meals or mine gems from ore deposits to sell, or find a consistent technique to roll strikes at Pondo's bowling alley. Speaking of which, the first two still work, minus the fact that they're both a bit more of a grind in Tears, with Hearty and Endura food being less available, and ore deposits are less common, with the gems selling for lesser amounts, as I'll explain a little bit more in a moment. But Pondo's Lodge has been shut down and is no longer an option for rupee farming. And yes, there are comparable other mini games like Selmie's Downhill Snowboarding Challenge, or the games that open after completing the Eventide Island quests, but nothing quite compares to the efficiency of rolling strikes at Pondo's. Arguably, maybe Tears does have that new Goron Strongman challenge, which is kinda quick if you know what you're doing, but it's still pretty slow compared to the almost guaranteed 300 rupees every 30 seconds or so you can earn from bowling at Pondo's. And yes, of course, both games have glitches which will expedite your rupee acquisition process tremendously, but for the purposes of this discussion, that's not the intended way, and the only real-world equivalent would be an elaborate scam or acts of counterfeiting, so we won't discuss any of those methods here. But obviously, I do love money glitches. But by now it seems Tears has put far less emphasis on the importance of rupees and would prefer players get rich on commodities. So then what about the cost of goods and services? There are 10 main settlements, and I'm not going to go deep dive on each individual one because it's excessive, and after visiting only a few, a pattern emerged. The 10 settlements are Hetano, a farming community where residents produce their own food and goods, and they trade a bit with nearby regions, but maintain a self-reliant way of life for the most part, and have one of the residents voted in regularly as mayor. We even get to see one of these new elections take place in Tears. Kakariko village, similar to Hiteno, but governed by its own elder Impa, showing us a localized leadership model rooted in cultural traditions rather than centralized law. In Tears, while Impa travels and adventures, her granddaughter Paya holds down the fort. Lurlin, in the southeast corner of the map, is a fishing village that thrives on its coastal resources, seemingly operating entirely outside of the influence of any higher authority. Goron City, home of the Rockmen and similar to Kakariko, is governed by the village elder Bluto, who continues training Yunobo to eventually lead their people through both games. And then Zora's Domain, which is interesting. The realm of the fish people is ruled by King Dorfin with his son and heir to the throne, Prince Sidon. This is where people might start to argue that Hyrule is an oligarchy of some kind, but I still say it's one big old monarchy, because King Dorfin has essentially the same power in the Zora's Domain region as Reese the farmer has in Hiteno. They're respected, they serve a necessary noble purpose serving the people at the local level, but there's a reason they don't live at the castle with Rome Boss Faramis, if you know what I'm saying, so let's continue. Gerudo Town, which is ruled by Riju, who inherited the throne when her mother passed away, and we know that Gerudo only have a male-born child every century or so, and when they do, he default becomes the king, which we all know how that turns out. Rito Village, again, is ruled by a village elder who just rises to the occasion to take on responsibilities nobody else is either willing or able to uphold. We see that with the big old owl dude in Breath of the Wild, and with our old friend Tiba stepping up in Tears, and we can assume his son Tulin will eventually hold the office. Then, of course, there's Terrytown, the thriving little place. It seems like Bolson, as the founder, has taken on the primary leadership role, but they also have kind of live and let live Lurlin village type of attitude. And how could we forget the Korok Forest, an oasis in the center of the Lost Woods, governed by the Great Deku Tree, and it has perhaps the most simple way of life? Karakara Bazaar, which is more of a commerce center like an outdoor mall or something rather than a town. But they have added a new store, so the shopping center has expanded. And finally, Lookout Landing in Tears, which is technically kind of the newest 11th settlement of Hyrule run by another Sheikah leader, much like a little sister city to Kakariko. Many identical items between the games sell for the exact same price at any given store. No inflation. Some prices went up or down, and some, like armor sets, changed while staying the same. And what do I mean by this? Well, the gems, for example, can be different. Flint sells for 5 rupees in both games, while Amber sells for 30 rupees in Breath of the Wild and only 10 in Tears of the Kingdom. Opal sells for 60 in Breath of the Wild and 30 in Tears of the Kingdom, half. Topaz sells for 180 in Breath of the Wild and only 80 in Tears of the Kingdom. Sapphire is 260 versus 150. Rubies are 210 versus 110. Some significant differences when talking about using gemstone farming as a form of rupee income. And then there are diamonds, which sell for 500 each in both games, along with many other things like bokoblin fangs that sell for the same amount, bananas, wild berries, restless crickets, etc. Continuing this pattern, the meat products all sell for the same price unless we're talking about seared or frozen, at which point prices fluctuate a bit. With clothing, take the Flamebreaker set for example. In Breath of the Wild, the headpiece costs 2,000 rupees, and in Tears it's only 1,400, a discount of 600 rupees. The torso is 600 in Breath of the Wild and 700 in Tears, so it went up $100. And the pants are 700 in Breath of the Wild and 1,200 in Tears, a $500 markup. The total breakdown is 3,300 for each, so regardless of the individual units of the set, the full kit costs the same between games. And so on. The same holds true for the Rito set, which sells for various prices, but always adds up to a cost of 2,150 for everything. Well, what about the old Hylian set? Hylian, Hylian. It's sold in Kakariko in Breath of the Wild and is available in Lookout Landing in Tears, but in Breath of the Wild, the hood goes for 60, the tunic for 120, and the trousers for 90, for an affordable total of 270 rupees. In tiers, the hood is 70, the tunic 130, and the trousers are 120, for a total of 320, a $100 rupee increase. And I also think it's cool that you're pointed in the direction where the Highlands set is sold right after completing the tutorial in both games as well. Across the aisle from the Hylian set in the Enchanted Boutique of Breath of the Wild is the Stealth Kit, which sells for an average of 600 per piece. In Tears of the Kingdom, the Stealth Kit goes from an insane price gouge of 5,000 a piece back down to an original pricing from the Breath of the Wild days, after you help the family business tend to their sick grandmother. And I can go on about the Radiant set and the Desert Voe set and all of them. But now that we're talking about the acquisition of armor, maybe it's a better time to start talking about the upgrading process and cost by turning our attention to the Great Fairy price breakdowns. Unlocking all 4 Great Fairy fountains in Breath of the Wild is as simple as locating them in the first place and then forking over the demanded amount of rupees. The first wants 100, then it's 500, then 1,000, and finally 10,000 rupees for a total of 11,600 to access full armor upgrade capability. In tiers, you don't need a single rupee to unlock all 4 fairies, but you do have to complete 4 separate side quests for the Stable Trotters band who wish to perform for them, and when they do, the fairies have enough gratitude to offer their upgrade services. And if you do it as part of the Lucky Clover Gazette quest, you can even make a few bucks. But in addition to the various materials, they require increasing amounts of rupees to go each step 1 to 4 stars. It goes 10 rupees, 50, 200, and then 500 for each piece to get up to 4 stars, which comes to a total of 760 rupees to upgrade each individual piece of upgradable armor, of which in Tears of the Kingdom there are 103. When it's all said and done, if I did my math correctly, and I triple checked. So take it as you will or do your own research, but to fully upgrade every upgradable piece of armor in Tears of the Kingdom will cost you 78,280 rupees. Breath of the Wild, by contrast, only has 58 upgradable pieces of armor, so if you did the math averaged out, it's still significantly more expensive to upgrade each individual piece of armor in Tears of the Kingdom. It's a crazy overworld out there, but at least when you have stuff you can part with to sell for rupees, the vendors still have unlimited buying power, so you can sell as much as you want and they'll always be able to pay up. So what else haven't we talked about yet? You can buy a house in Hitano in Breath of the Wild for 3,000 and a bunch of chopped wood, and then there are 14 upgrades at 100 rupees each for a grand total of 4,400 rupees to fully upgrade that home. In tiers, you can buy a plot of land for 1,500, a discounted rate for helping out the Hudsons with a side quest, and then build a fully customized home with up to 15 rooms, ranging from 250 to 600 rupees each, giving you way more customization and design and also how much your home will cost, and starting you out with 1 room for half the cost of the Hitano home. It all comes down to the grind. In Breath of the Wild, acquiring enough star fragments or dragon parts, for example, was one of the most tedious aspects of clothing upgrades because there was a lot of camping and waiting. In Tears, the grind could take longer because there's just generally way more stuff to do in the game, but there's less waiting because you're continuously doing something new. And if you just follow your curiosity in both games, explore, take your time to pick up whatever you see along the way, and engage with enemies regularly as you progressively level up, then upper 90-something% of the time you're gonna have whatever you need on hand when it comes to needing to sell items for rupees or trade them for side quest requirements, upgrades, all that stuff. And then when it comes to the upper level armor upgrades, say 3 and 4 stars, you may have a bit more adventuring to do, but it's always manageable. But if you rush through the game and don't pick hardly anything up along the way, of course you're gonna be more in poverty. That's how life works. So, could the system we see in Hyrule exist in real life, or does it rely too much on fantasy aspects? And if it could, what are some examples? And if not, why not? Well, as I said at the beginning, Hyrule as we know it, at least in the memory scenes of both games, is best described as a monarchy. And simply put, monarchies have and still do exist. In medieval Europe, kings ruled in different degrees of centralized control and relied on their nobles and whatnot to manage territories the same way. Even modern constitutional monarchies, they're not the best example of Hyrule's system, but nations like the UK or Denmark do still operate under a monarchy combined with democratic systems. The problem is that every single person capable of taking the reins of leadership at the national level was either killed during the calamity or remained spiritually headlocked in a century-long metaphysical battle with the essence of evil. King Rome, Zelda, Link, the champions, they're all gone. Sorry, as we already discussed, leadership has formed more on the local level, and that's all well and good, but the fall of centralized governance and the rise of localized rule, as seen in Breath of the Wild, before we get into the events of Tears of the Kingdom, it could lead to fragmented power structures and civil unrest. We wouldn't want the Zora trying to claim Goron territory or anything like that. So it's a good thing Zelda comes back, because until the end of Breath of the Wild, Hyrule really had more of a century-long anarchist system. There were still rules in the society, just no rulers to enforce them. Because again, the central governing body, the Hyrulean royal family, had been obliterated during the calamity, leaving no ruling authority to enforce laws, command the army, or coordinate social functions, nothing. And the people adapted by relying on decentralized, community-based systems to survive, cooperating autonomously in a post-calamity recovery process. And with the end of Breath of the Wild, especially the true ending, the rebuilding phase begins with Zelda and Link's return. We see explosive growth with Hudson's construction business. Hudson is the dominant construction company now, while Boltson is working on rebuilding contracts with Lurlin since wrapping up in Hitano. Anyway, infrastructure has been invested in heavily. Stables, a headquarters for news media, a school, road repairs and trade routes, all and more have been improved in the few short years that pass between the two games. Okay, so sure, taking the basic premise that the form of government in Zelda could exist in real life, what about the economy? Let's recap it here real quick. Hyrule's economy is simple and decentralized. It has a barter and trade system supplemented by a universal currency. Major elements to keep in mind are how the small villages are mostly self-sufficient, but there's resource-based trade with merchants exchanging goods between them. There's no visible taxation or centralized economic policy. That's a big one. Must be nice. Don't even get me started. That is not a rabbit hole for a Zelda channel to explore, but it does raise the question, could a system like this exist? Partially, I'd say, with limitations. Some historical examples, again, might be medieval Europe, where localized economies had a barter system and it functioned on to trade and minimal use of coinage. And pre-industrial economies in general had people living on farms producing goods just to have their own needs met, with limited labor and production, bartering systems, people working businesses living out of their homes, being assigned roles or status based on birth, not achievement, or plain old tradition, living in villages with few roads and public transportation in between, making travel difficult, only for those adventurous travelers maybe. And people are growing their own food, raising their own animals, making their own clothes, all sorts of stuff. There are also small, isolated communities that have and still do exist in the real world, in rural and remote places, where communities rely on local resources and occasional trade maybe, but it also makes me think of the North Sentinel Island, which the Indian government prohibits from traveling within 3 nautical miles or 5.6 kilometers to protect the tribal reserve who live there completely independent of the rest of the world. Besides, they're fatally violent to newcomers anyway. There's just a lot of issues with this system as it is for scalability and efficiency and the ability to respond to crises, is all I'm saying. At the end of the day, Hyrule's governance and economy work in the context of fantasy, right? We see some magic and it eliminates some of the logistical and logical barriers. You know, you can warp with the Sheikah Slate or the Purapad, and Zelda's just realized her powers. What else can she do now that we haven't even seen yet? And then there's the respawning in of things like ore deposits, effectively giving you unlimited gem farming in a way that's absolutely not possible in real life. Once a resource is excavated, it's not there anymore. Hyrule does have a low population overall, and smaller populations make decentralization more manageable. There aren't really that many NPCs around the overworld, you know what I mean? People say Breath of the Wild particularly feels more lonely at times, probably due to its post-apocalyptic vibes. And the simplified system that's portrayed here, I mean, the game doesn't even depict or address any of the systematic problems like inflation, taxation, labor disputes. I mean, I talk about resource scarcity earlier, but like I just said, everything does spawn back in, at least the stuff that's not in a treasure chest, so you could go back and get more, it just takes longer in Tears of the Kingdom. But overall, it's just a way more gigantic game, so everything should be more of a marathon and less of a sprint. Not to say that Breath of the Wild was a sprint, but it was more like a 10K or a half marathon in comparison to content. So anyway, while aspects of Hyrule's system, monarchy, tribal governance, barter economies, simple free markets, they have existed and do exist in some form or another in our real-world history. Replicating this system today would be impractical due to the complexities of modern society. However, I'd love to live in a society ruled by a genuinely benevolent and strong leader and not have to pay taxes, but I've also been called an idealist utopian. But whatever the case, may your rupees always remain plentiful. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you made it this far, obviously you like Zelda stuff to some extent, leave a like on the video, please. It helps other Zelda lovers find the channel. And in lieu of doing a members only challenge at the end of this video, because I've got other plans I'm playing around with, I just got everybody's name up here at the end of the show. Thank you so very much to all of my channel members, and we're going to be doing more members exclusive live streams where I'll be going and continuing my quest to beat the game faster than 28 minutes. I'm working on it. Anyway, that's all for now, so until next time, stay cool and always keep punching out there. Aloha.